The 1960s brought about more radical social change than perhaps any other decade in American history. One group that brought about that change was the New Left. By 1965, college students became a strong voice of social and political protest. The New Left were young liberals who had voted for LBJ and felt left behind and abandoned by him because of his constant support for the Vietnam War. They demanded sweeping change and a political revolution in American government. The New Left had many issues with the status quo, including the disproportion of black and poor young people who were being drafted into the war. They also demanded an end to the college draft deference. The New Left thought it unfair that you could avoid military service because you were going to college. They felt that it unfairly favored rich kids over poor kids. They protested the immorality of the Vietnam War. And they also felt that it was wrong that the United States was involved in a Vietnamese civil war and favored a side that was just as corrupt as the communists.
In the spring of 1967, anti-war groups instigate volatility at rallies and marches. Hundreds of thousands of students burned their draft cards, shouting, "Hell no, we won't go." The Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS, believed that corporations and the Pentagon had taken over the United States. They felt that the military had too much power, and they wanted to return the power back to the people. The era also brought about the free speech movement. This movement began at Cal Berkeley, and they stood for the freedom to openly criticize the United States war machine.
We're asking that there be no restrictions on the content of speech save those provided by the courts. And that's an enormous amount of freedom.
There was also a push for a stop to the building of new nuclear weapons and a stop to the arms race, and this was called the Nuclear Freeze Movement.
Perhaps most famously, the 1960s gave birth to the counterculture. The counterculture was a movement of disillusioned, middle-class youths who turned away from society. These young people were tired of war and social injustice in the United States, and together they looked to create a new society. The counterculture created the hippie culture of the 1960s. More radical than the New Left, hippies experimented with LSD and other mind-altering drugs. They explored Eastern religions, and they lived in communes or small communities, expressing free love without sexual rules. The philosophy of the counterculture was to tune in, turn on, and drop out. This essentially meant to tune in to what's important in life, turn on to drugs, and drop out of society. The center of the counterculture was San Francisco, California, mostly due to the fact that California had very relaxed drug laws.
The counterculture lasted a brief time, but changed American society forever. Their complete rebellion against conventional lifestyle opened new doors. Some of these changes are exemplified in art and music. There was a rise in pop art, including works by Andy Warhol, and there was a rise in psychedelic music, and this changed Americans' perception of art's message. There was also a change in cultural roles. The idea of do your own thing changed attitudes towards sex, families, careers, and social discussion of taboo issues. The counterculture movement allowed Americans to talk about things that were not as accepted during the 1950s. There was still pushback to this movement because some Americans saw the movement as corrosive to traditional American values.
Another very important movement of the 1960s was the women's liberation movement. In 1963, author Betty Friedan published her book, The Feminine Mystique. The book challenged social limits on women and sparked hidden ambition in females everywhere. It challenged them to be more than housewives and mothers, and to follow their own path and careers. The book and the feelings it created ignited the feminist movement. This movement advocated that women and men should have economic, political, and social equality. As the movement grew, it also became more diverse. Housewives, college students, minorities, and celebrities like Gloria Steinem joined. More radical and militant groups formed. As a sign of protest, they would burn their bras, and they protested the Miss America pageant because they felt that it objectified women too much. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s gained many social victories for women in America. Social roles and expectations for women changed. Women put off having families until later in life and went back to school to get new skills, and birth control rates jumped. The women's liberation movement also gained a victory in the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, 1973. In their decision in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that women had a right to choose to have an abortion if that is what they wanted. It was a major victory for the pro-choice movement that felt women had a right to control their bodies. Before Roe v. Wade, abortions were illegal, but they were still performed behind closed doors, usually with dangerous mortality rates. Abortion is still a very hot topic discussed in American politics today. The women's liberation movement also inspired the creation of the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW. This group advocated women's rights in the workplace, including equal pay and protection against sexual harassment. The women's movement of the 1960s also inspired the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. This was a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution that would guarantee women equal rights to men under the law of the United States. It was defeated in 1973 and never added to the Constitution, but it began to generate a discussion on what equal rights were and how to better guarantee them to women.
The 1960s also brought about gains for minorities. Latino farm workers under the leadership of Cesar Chavez began to organize. Prior to the movement, they were not able to unionize. Cesar Chavez went on a hunger strike and led a great boycott. Cesar Chavez led this Chicano movement and won better pay, and he also won better rights for migrant workers in California. Next, Native Americans wanted more independence in their own affairs. The American Indian movement, also called AIM, called for greater Indian autonomy and ethnic pride. In 1972, the Indian Education Act gave tribes control over their own affairs, their land, and their schools. And finally, affirmative action. Affirmative action set up programs that made special efforts for discriminated groups in colleges and work. Groups of people that would previously be discriminated against in education or work would now have more opportunity to succeed. The belief was equal opportunity could bring equal success.
With social groups clamoring for change at home and violent protests and rallies in the streets, America was in the midst of a social revolution, a revolution like no other in its history. Modern American history, as we know it today, was being born in the 1960s, and everything was changing.